Good morning. It's early morning here in Brooklyn. I'm sipping from my coffee. I want to talk about telecommunication, communicating information over long distances, how it was done before, how it's done now, and possibly the future of it. So when you're talking about long distance communication, there's two main splits. There's the analog and then there's electrical. For analog, there was a lot of cool stuff they did, but there was also a lot of limitations. So the solutions relied on predetermined messages. So these are things like smoke signals and other beacons, where you would basically have to say, when you see the smoke, or when you see the fire, or when you see the flash of light, that means the enemy is approaching. So this is like the Paul Revere lantern story of flashing the lanterns if they're arriving by sea versus if they're arriving by land. You already determine what the message is, and then you just use a single bit of information to signal that message.
When I got to another ocean, I figured since I'd gone this far, I might as well just turn back.
Beacons is one of the main first types of analog telecommunication. So it's called like an optical telegraph. It just uses visual signals to convey information, like a lighthouse, a smoke signal, or a semaphore line. So originally fires would be lit to signal approaching enemies or synchronize military attacks. Things got more sophisticated pretty quickly. So the semaphore is really cool. It looked like this, and it used pivoting blades with positions corresponding to information. So those blades would change their position on their axis, and that would correspond to different letters or different messages. So it actually got off of the 1-bit constraint of like a fire or smoke signal or a lantern. It basically had 8 possible positions of 45-degree increments, which adds up to 64 code elements. Then things got more sophisticated with this guy, a French engineer named Claude Chap, and he devised the Chap system, which was basically a network of these semaphores covering France. And I think there was a total of 556. So that's pretty cool. Another cool analog optical telegraph is the heliograph. So that's like using mirrors to reflect sunlight to correspond with different messages. So think like early Morse code, where you have 2 flashes meaning this, 1 flash meaning that. There's also audio signals. Historically, drums were used in Africa for certain messages, which is pretty cool, because then when you start talking about complex rhythms, you definitely get more sophisticated.
Go, Mordecai!
The other cool thing, which is kind of like intuitive, is the use of animals, but specifically homing pigeons. This allowed for non-predetermined messages, because I could write fully my thoughts and send it off with a pigeon. Flights as long as 1,100 miles have been recorded, so a pigeon could fly 1,100 miles and return home safely. So this use of homing pigeons was believed to start in the Persian Empire. The Romans and Greeks used it as well, and it was also used in World War I and World War II. 32 of the pigeons were actually awarded medals for their service. And there's this one pigeon, Cher Ami, who lost her foot and eye in combat, but delivered her message regardless to a group of American infantrymen and purportedly saved their lives because the message was crucial. So like the famous homing pigeon comes from a species called the rock pigeon, which were selectively bred to find their way back. But the rock pigeon already has a evolutionary innate capacity for this, which researchers believe is rooted in magnetoreception, which is basically your ability, if you're an animal, to perceive magnetic fields. And you can use these to say, okay, this is my position globally. This same trait is present in bacteria, arthropods, and more. We don't have it, humans don't have it, but one thing I found is researchers did find a protein that they think could serve this function, which is pretty cool.
Producing smooth and steady power that looks like this.
So the 1830s, early 19th century is when things start getting interesting. Scientists across the world are stumbling upon electricity and the phenomenon of electricity. So experiments began as early as like 1780s, 1790s, but right on the turn of the century.
Hey, there's a telegraph line, you got yours and I got mine.
So the first working telegraph was built by an English inventor named Francis Ronalds. That was in 1816, and it used static electricity. So static electricity is that stationary electric charge, usually caused by friction, like rubbing the balloon on your hair. There's a transfer of electrons, and they just sit there. And so this principle was used for an electric telegraph. Then there was electrochemical telegraphs, which are pretty wild. This guy Samuel Thomas von Sommering developed it, and it was in 1809. So there was 35 wires that would span the distance you want to communicate, and they were all, so the 35 corresponds to the Latin letters and numbers, most of them, and the wires would span over the short distances, and then they'd be submerged in acidic solution, so acidic liquid. And when the current of electricity ran through the desired wire, so like you want to press A, the electricity would go and it would terminate into the acid bath, and it would build up, the electric charge would transfer into the acidic solution, and these hydrogen bubbles would bubble up into that glass tube. So on the receiving end, you would see that glass tube bubbling up, and you would know, okay, if they're saying the letter A, they would write it down. So that's pretty neat. Then there's this guy Hans Christian Ørsted, and in 1820, he noticed that the electric current creates a magnetic field. It's electromagnetism. And so, but what he noticed is that it would actually, the current would deflect a metal needle when you ran it through. So different currents, a stronger current would deflect it more, a weaker current would deflect it less. So you could span like your desired alphabet and then deflect the needle corresponding to each letter, which is pretty neat. And then there's this team, Charles Wheatstone and William Cook. They developed an electric telegraph using wires and needles. It was the same principle, but it could, as the other one, deflecting needles, but it could do it over 13 miles, which was the farthest it had ever been done. That was in the 1830s in England. Then comes along Samuel Morse, who we all know from the famous Morse code. And so there's this crazy story. Samuel Morse was working on a painting. He was kind of a generalist, a Renaissance man. He was working on a commissioned painting away from his house. And he received a message one day, a letter hand-delivered, that just said, "Your dear wife is convalescent." It was from his dad. And he received another message a few days later saying, "Your wife is dead." And he felt so bad that he had been happily painting while his wife was dead that he thought, we have to improve this system of communication. So he basically improves the current electric telegraphs, those ones that can span 13 miles, the needle deflecting, and creates a single wire system. So that's a huge jump in sophistication, because before, remember like the acid bath one was 35 wires, the other ones were several wires, and you have to span them a great distance, so it can get complicated. But Morse developed a single wire system and a code to correspond to it, which was the most sophisticated, and just intuitively they made the most common letters of the alphabet the fewest symbols, and vice versa. And he actually collaborated with an NYU chemist named Leonard Gale, and they came up with this idea to create even longer distances, able to communicate even longer distances, by using the principle of a relay, which was beginning to be established, and Leonard Gale had worked on it. So they would put these electric relays at various intervals, which would basically re-up the current and allow the messages to travel even further. But yeah, so there was like a huge dispute too about who gets credit, because a lot of times in these early phases of invention, there's so many contributors, and then it happens to be the one person positioned in the right spot at the right time and it's a level of genius to synthesize all the ideas and put them together. So not just a single scrap of info, but you zoom out in the bird's eye view and are able to create something out of everything. And so this was the case with Samuel Morse and these other guys. They're all working on, vital components to the overall whole. So actually, there's this funny quote from Samuel Morse talking about the battle for who gets the credit. He says,
I have been so constantly under the necessity of watching the movements of the most unprincipled set of pirates I have ever known, that all my time has been occupied in defense, in putting evidence into something like legal shape, that I am the inventor of the electromagnetic telegraph. Would you have believed it 10 years ago that a question could be raised on the subject?
I thought that was hilarious.
So now we have these, a single wire system, a sender and a receiver, and this code to correspond with it. But now you get into the discussion of the logistics. How do we create a network of these? And so this is when we start using submarine and transatlantic cables. The first communication across the Atlantic occurred on August 16th, 1858, and it reduced the communication time between North America and Europe from 10 days, which was the time it took to sail across and deliver a message verbally. It reduced it from 10 days to a matter of minutes. So that's an exponential change because of this technology. That's pretty sweet.
Well, I can't hear you very well. Come closer to the telephone.
On the heels of these inventions comes the telephone, which is basically, you're not relying on modulating electric current, with some sort of pressure or some sort of deflecting needle. You're actually now able to transmit speech through this electricity modulation. And actually hear the corresponding sound waves on the other end. So the electric telephone was invented in the 1870s. Alexander Graham Bell held the master patent, so he kind of gets the credit, but it's the same situation where, he was working from these masters behind him and using all their great inventions to put it together collectively in a telephone. So this is the principle of using sound waves to modulate the electric signals. So when I'm speaking, it's vibrating the air, and those different pressures are what hit your eardrum, and they tickle your little hairs inside your inner ear, and that is how you hear. So with the electric telephone, it's a similar principle. It's basically, you have a diaphragm which can move, and when I speak into it, it moves the diaphragm, which corresponds to various pressures. If I'm saying one word, it creates a unique pressure versus another word. Then behind that diaphragm were these tightly packed carbon grains. So think of like a grain of sand, but it was carbon. And they would change their density, their compactness, based on that vibrating diaphragm from speech. And when the electric current ran through it, if it was more packed or less packed, it would create a weaker or stronger current. And that would correlate to what I was saying. And this isn't real time, it's very quick. That's the benefit of using electricity for communication. Electrons travel extremely quick, not as quick as light, but very, very quickly. So you modulate the signal with your voice, and then on the receiving end, you can transfer it back into sound waves.
Sound travels in waves.
So up until 1927, we relied on this telephone to carry messages. But then the radio comes around the same time, but it's basically a departure. You're getting away from lines, electric lines. But there is something interesting. In 1880, there's a wireless telephone via the photophone. The photophone is crazy. So it allowed for speech to be transmitted on a beam of light. So it used photons instead of electrons to carry speech. This is what it looked like. It's really wonky looking. But basically, so this is invented by Bell and his assistant, Charles Tainter. So this is in the 1880s at Bell Labs. And it used modulated light instead of modulated electricity, like the telephone. So the early versions weren't electrical. They used what's called the photoacoustic effect, which is basically various materials, when light hits them, they convert different vibrations, which is sound. So you have one material that when light hits it converts it to a sound signal. So that's the non-electric version. But basically, they quickly became the electric version, which this is how it works. So the sound source, I'm speaking, and that makes the speaker vibrate, which produces sound. And there's this small mirror attached to the speaker, and that mirror vibrates. And when the sun hits the mirror, those photons, those light waves, are coming off at a different angle corresponding to how the mirror's vibrating, which is corresponding to how I'm speaking. So then you have a receiver, which is basically a photodetector, which is reading where the photons are hitting. And it corresponds those changes in position from the oscillating mirror reflecting sunlight to the original sound wave that would have to have tilted the mirror that way to end up sending a photon to that position on the photodetector. And then it can convert it back into sound waves, which is pretty crazy. I mean, that's super sick. But yeah, so then there's the radio, which is basically the sophisticated version of wireless communication. In 1884, there's this Italian engineer, Marconi, and he develops the early radio using the newly discovered radio wave phenomenon. He uses his invention to transmit audio across the Atlantic wirelessly. That's in 1884. That's crazy. And then World War I accelerated the innovation, making this commercially viable. And in the 1920s, radio broadcasting by that time is the norm.
And so, we're on the air. Let's see how the broadcast gets from the studio to your home. Of course, you don't hear the real sounds over your home radio. What you hear is a translation of the sounds. The picture of a sound wave, if we could see it, would look very much like this. These sound waves, made by the musical instruments, travel in all directions at once. Some of them are hitting that microphone and being picked up by it. The microphone is simply an electrical ear, the ear of the broadcast listeners. It picks up sound waves and converts them into electrical current. The operation of the microphone is very similar to the telephone in your home. Any sound, such as music or a voice, pushes this metal ribbon back and forth, causing a corresponding back and forth movement in an electrical current. When I say 1, the ribbon moves back and forth. Watch again. 1. This action of the ribbon sends an electrical current along the wire that leads from the microphone. If I say 1, 2, 3, 4, the ribbon dances back and forth a lot of times and sends a lot of different currents down the wire. All the electrical currents from all the microphones are controlled and sent out to the transmitting stations. These currents form what we call the audio wave.
There. That wasn't so bad, was it?
Okay, and then, of course, there's TV and video. That's the next step in communication. It's basically transmitting moving images. So there's this concept in humans called the persistence of vision, which is basically your eye stitches together freeze frames that it sees and creates the illusion of movement. So this is basically how early mechanical televisions worked, or moving images. It's kind of like the flipping notebook and seeing the doodle move. It's stop motion. And they would just, move these film reels quick enough, and your eye would think it was just one fluid image. And then basically they take it from mechanical to electrical.
Your father kissed me for the very first time on that dance floor. And it was then that I realized that I was going to spend the rest of my life with him.
The next huge step is obviously the internet.
Are you social or antisocial?
I guess I haven't really been social in a while, mostly because...
In your voice, I sense hesitance.
So it begins with the development of electronic computers. This is in the 50s. And they had this concept of a wide area networking concept. So basically, this started out with just several computers in science labs in the US, England, and France. And this was heavily tied to military research, obviously. The Department of Defense awards contracts in the 1960s, which funds this project, ARPANET. And ARPANET sends the first message in 1969 from a computer. And this guy, Professor Leonard Kleinrock's lab at the university, UCLA, to a second network node at Stanford. And then basically you start these local area networks and wide area networks, and you can have these little computers communicating with each other. And that's basically where we are now. Obviously, it's gotten way quicker and way more efficient. I mean, you can do a YouTube Live or a Facebook Live, and it's just immediately transmitted out to everyone. So that got me thinking, like, what is the future of telecommunication?
Hello, Hal, do you read me? Hello, Hal, do you read me?
What's the next big leap, or is this kind of the global maximum for innovation? And so I was looking in, I found some cool videos and some cool reading. There's like, obviously the Star Trek badges, you know, Captain Kirk to engineering, but that's kind of like a telephone, like it's the same amount of speed, but an interesting point I saw is that it's a different philosophy of communication than we currently have. There's no ringtone. You know, if Kurt wants to talk to engineering, or if they want to talk to Kurt, it's just instant.
Janeway to security.
It's patched in, and you have to listen. Versus we have this, you know, inherent concept of privacy built in, where you have to see who's calling and choose if you want to answer it or not. Okay, then there's the ansible, which is basically, or ansible, which is faster than light communication. This is a concept that was coined by the sci-fi author Ursula Le Guin. And it was also, I first heard about it from Ender's Game, Orson Scott Card, and I think that kind of popularized it. In Ender's Game, there's the ansib, they call it for short. It basically functions off this fictional particle called it's a fictional subatomic particle called the phylote. There's this quantum phenomena of particle entanglement. If you affect a particle on one end of the universe, it instantaneously will alter its corresponding entangled particle no matter how far it is, so it's faster than light. And I think that concept's kind of been overhyped, overused to be something that's not, because this idea is basically saying if we could manipulate that particle that's entangled with another one, we could communicate across the universe instantly. Then I started thinking about something more practical, like where are things going realistically? And I started thinking, obviously, about virtual reality. Then the internet becomes three-dimensional. It's not just 2D on your screen, but you're actually, when you're visiting a website, you're in the website. You're in like a 3D room that is YouTube, or you're in a 3D room that is Wikipedia. And you can move around in it, and you can interact with it. This concept of a walkable internet, I learned, was actually conceived in Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. So basically these rooms are the websites, and you can, you know, go to this website by leaving the room and going to the next one. If you happen to be at one website, you can discuss the content with the other visitors. You can see them and talk to them about the website. There would be this idea of internet cities, certain areas of the internet, maybe linked by, you know, category or popularity or content type. And there would be these cities of the internet, and you could explore them. So eventually I came up with this idea. There'd be these whole virtual cities that would be off limits, you know, whether it's age restriction or ideological restriction. Like, you would literally be in an echo chamber of your political beliefs, because you would just be in your city, and your city would correspond to the content you like. So you wouldn't even realize there were other cities. And there would be, you know, these brave explorers going to new ideological continents, and finding out there's a whole nother world of internet out there. I don't know if that's how it would pan out, but then I was thinking, like, paywalls would be actual armed guards, or think about internet trolls in a virtual internet. It would literally just be people screaming at you. And then I think another huge thing that people talk about for the future of telecommunication is the idea of the brain chip interface. Elon Musk has his, you know, company Neuralink, and it's the idea, you know, you get your chip in your brain.
How does this motherfucker have all this time and all this energy and all these ideas, and then people just let him do these things?
Because I'm an alien.
And then you have access to the internet, like you have access to a memory. You'll just remember when the Gettysburg Address happened, rather than searching it.
That's like the purpose of Neuralink, is to create a high bandwidth interface to the brain such that we can be symbiotic with AI.
And then also, how are we going to communicate? If I have a chip and you have a chip, is it just going to be telepathy? There's not going to be an audio signal corresponding to it. It's just going to be a neuron signal, which maybe hits my language faculty, and then I just know what you're saying.
I think we'll have something interesting to announce in a few months.
I used like a ton of great references and links, which will all be below. It's really fascinating. Yeah, I don't know. That's all. Peace.